that George Marsden, he's a historian of religion. He was at Duke for a long time and moved to Notre Dame to finish out his career. And he's has a long-standing interest in the history of Protestant religion, particularly in the 19th century, and the rise of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. And he sort of wrote the book, the sort of standard bearer for the history of the rise of fundamentalism in the early 20th century. So one of the other books he wrote was called The Soul of the University, and this was written in the early 90s. And there was then, and I think still today, this sort of question, this identity crisis that I think universities are going through. So what is the purpose of a university? And I think we got a taste of that a couple of years ago when we were rewriting our university mission statement. And you have this group of faculty, and I think if we were to try to rewrite that mission statement, we'd see the same kind of challenges here. We've got this group of faculty that pretty much all are doing the same kind of work. We're all academics, so we're not drawing from the general population. It's a selected sample. And the question is, what's the mission of Clemson University? And we had a really tough time coming to a consensus on what Clemson should be about. And I think this is something that isn't specific to Clemson. This is true nationwide and really all across the West. What is the purpose of a university? And the way we've justified ourselves largely has been the economic development. The reason we exist is to help students get jobs. So students pay gobs and gobs of money to come here in order to get a credential that'll help them get a job when they leave. And so we justified almost everything we do in those terms. I mean, the reason you take the humanities courses is so that you can become a better writer, so that you can communicate better when you go get a job. The reason you take these math classes or you take these other general ed classes, they're all kind of geared towards how does this make you a more productive worker when you leave. And so no one's really comfortable with that, though. None of us want to admit that the reason we're here is job training. And so what is the purpose of a university? What is the role of a university? The answer to that question was given by Cardinal Newman back in the 19th century, the idea of a university. And that was sort of the standard bearer for a long time. But, universities evolved, and we had Kerr's response to that in the 1960s. He was the president of Berkeley. And, his idea was that we don't have a university anymore. We have a multiversity. And we have to, the modern research university isn't a university. We just sort of have to make our peace with that. It talked about the role of scholarship and research, rolling back the frontier of knowledge and this sort of thing. And that's okay as far as it goes, but that's not really what we do necessarily in all of the different things that we do. And it's not really how we justify ourselves to the public. And so there are these different critiques of knowledge. And in the early 90s, we had the science wars going on as subject, postmodernism was sort of in its heyday. And so as George Marsden was thinking, what's that? The science wars? Yeah, so this is... this idea of, is science imperialistic? Is this hegemony that science sort of has in terms of knowledge and so forth in society really justified or not? Is there really such a thing as objectivity and all of these sorts of things that were sort of swirling around? And as this was going on, one of the things that George was thinking about at the time was sort of what is the soul? How did we get to where we are today? How did the university evolve? And so he wrote this book, this history of the evolution of the university in the United States, and at the end of it, he had this postscript where he talked about he went from sort of being descriptive and took off his historian's hat and said, okay, so what should Christianity be doing in the university? And that caused all kinds of a ruckus. There were, for several issues of the Chronicle of Higher Ed, there were letters back and forth and people asking, what are you talking about? So he would respond to critics and they would re-respond. So out of all of that, he wrote another book, what he called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. So this was sort of his morally track-length answer to the question of what is Christian scholarship? What does he mean when he says Christian scholarship? And so I thought what I would do today to kind of spur on the conversation is sort of give the thumbnail sketch of the history that he gives in The Soul of the American University. So how did we get from basically all colleges being sort of what we know as seminaries today to the modern research university? Why are we what we are today? And then what does Christian scholarship mean, and why wouldn't we want to do, quote, Christian scholarship? What are the arguments against that, or the arguments for silence? And then, given that, sort of what are some of the responses to that, and then what would Christian scholarship even look like? So what would that be? And then what are some of the potentials and dangers that we would face in sort of trying to implement that here at Clemson as Christian faculty? So that's sort of the big picture I have in mind. Let's see. So the history. This is sort of the outline I just gave. The subtitle of his book, "The Soul of the American University," was "From the Protestant Establishment to Established Disbelief." So you go from having this very secure Protestant establishment in higher ed that sort of ruled the sort of pace-setting universities, as it were, well into the early 20th century, to really starting in the 60s and forward, this sort of establishment of disbelief in universities, the requirement that you sort of set your religion aside, you don't bring it into your scholarship. And what are some of the arguments for doing that? Are there good reasons for doing that? Why did that disestablishment happen? And then what difference could it make? So this is just sort of the big picture. So what's the thumbnail sketch? And I think this history is important to sort of kind of get the context of where we are today. And like I said, I'm not a historian. What I'm doing is summarizing his summary of what he did here. So those of you that are really interested in sort of the nuts and bolts of the history going on here, I would strongly encourage to go and read. And if you think I've mischaracterized anything that he's wrote or something doesn't sound quite right, that's probably me mischaracterizing what he wrote, not him making a mistake. He is the Francis A. McInerney Professor of History. So, I mean, I'm sure he's right. But in the early sort of U.S., we had these Dartmouth was started as sort of a missionary school to train folks to go out into the frontier and evangelize the Native Americans. Harvard was initially a sort of a religious school training ministers, and this was sort of the rule for virtually all colleges in the U.S. that were founded in the 17th and 18th century here. And we had lots of colleges around the country, not just the ones that are Ivy Leagues today. A lot of those collapsed and sort of faded away or changed their identity. But largely what they were was clergy were training other ministers. And so they were sort of mini seminaries. They had very small enrollments, graduating classes of like 8. Sort of almost a glorified Sunday school in a lot of ways. And so if you wanted to get sort of a real degree, real training, you went to Germany, you got your PhD from the German system. Now, one of the things that happened in the early 19th century is you had this sort of frontier, this movement into the frontier, and this entrepreneurialism and sort of reinventing yourself, and that applied to religion as well. We saw this in the Second Great Awakening, this explosion of expressions of Christianity. And so you didn't just have your Anglicans, Lutherans, and Presbyterians anymore. You had your Restorationist sects, you had your the different kinds of holiness sects, and these sorts of independent groups that formed up. The Mormons kind of came into existence in the early part of the 19th century. And so you had all of this, a lot of sort of religious creativity. But the one thing almost all of these groups had in common, even when they were throwing aside their confessional standards.
It's just my.
Oh, okay. Should I respond?
I got to turn it up.
The sort of the slogan, particularly with the some of the Restorationist sects like the Stone Campbell movement and so forth, was this idea of no creed but the Bible, no confession but Christ. We're going to throw off these confessional standards that are sort of kind of they're sectarian, they're kind of holding us back. We want to get rid of that and go straight to the Bible, not let anything else get in the way. And that was true for both what we would call today maybe conservative groups and liberal groups, but they still had, even the groups that were doing this, they still had this idea, this Protestant idea that you could rally around the Scripture and that the big questions could be answered by the Bible. The Bible is sort of the source of any kind of moral dispute or questions about reality. You could always turn to the Bible to get the answer. And that was killed by the Civil War. Civil War, Mark Knoll writes that the Civil War was largely a theological dispute. People were arguing. They had this deep question, the abolitionists on one side and the slave owners, or those that were sympathetic to slave owning on the other side, that were both marshaling Bible and theological tradition to answer this deep moral question. And this deep moral question wasn't answered by appealing to Scripture that was supposed to be perspicuous and that was supposed to be sufficient and all the rest. It was answered at the end of the gun. And when you look at sort of the death rate, it was something like 2% of all people in the U.S. were at the time were killed in things tied to the Civil War. That's about 10 times the death rate that we saw in World War II and about 100 times the death rate we saw during the Vietnam War. So, I mean, it really had a huge impact and was just a devastating life event. But one of the things it did for a lot of people emerging out of that is it created this huge gap for higher criticism of the Bible. The Bible was no longer seen as a sufficient guide for all of life. You couldn't answer this fundamental question about slavery. What else can it not answer? And so what you saw in the post-Civil War era in a lot of different theological groups, particularly like at Union Seminary, for example, was this rejection of, traditional Protestant founding on Scripture. Now, what that did, the other thing that happened in this was this desire for unity. The secession was beat back. We're going to take over the whole continental United States from shore to shore. We're going to unify it. We're going to become an imperial power. We're going to be a country that's industrialized. And we need to rally around something. And the one thing that was definitely non-sectarian, if anything was non-sectarian, was science. It didn't matter. The laws of thermodynamics work the same way, whether you're a Buddhist or a Catholic or a Presbyterian. It didn't matter. The laws of science just were what they were. But you still needed some sort of moral foundation. So the idea was, in the sort of liberal Protestant culture, was to push aside the doctrinal stuff that would just cause divisiveness anyway, and unify around the sort of moral tradition that came out of Protestantism. And so what you got was sort of a certain kind of moralism that sort of replaced any kind of doctrinal distinctiveness. And that became a big push in the late 19th century. Now, of course, if you're an industrialist trying to build an empire, you have a strong interest in building that kind of unity, getting people to agree about the basic moral questions and so forth. And so you're going to go and found universities that are going to push that, put science forefront, and then kind of push doctrinal issues to the side, but kind of keep the moral core. And what you saw was the American Baptist Educational Society, through a grant from Rockefeller and land given by Marshall Fields, founded the school south of Chicago that we now know today as the University of Chicago. And you had Johns Hopkins, a Quaker, who wanted to do kind of the same thing, who founded a university that's now Johns Hopkins University, sort of the first German-style research university in the United States. And Vanderbilt and Carnegie Mellon, and you've got Vanderbilt, and you've got all of these schools. Northwestern, which was originally sort of a Bible college, Evans came in and did the same kind of thing there, and building up sort of a massive funding endowments in the late 19th century that sort of said, let's put science to the forefront, but let's hold on to this moral core. So even into the 1950s, places like the University of Michigan still had compulsory chapel attendance for their students. You still had to go to chapel, and you still had to hear Bible stories and this sort of thing. But the idea was that you didn't want to talk doctrine. You didn't want to be separate. You didn't want the Methodists and the Presbyterians at each other's throats.
So the Bible is still
a source of moral instruction. That's right. That was the idea there. But that became under further sort of assault with World War II and the Holocaust. And what you see is a shift from talking about sort of Protestantism and the sort of dominance of Protestantism to sort of Judeo-Christian values. And people talking about Judeo-Christian values now. The idea of, now let's pull Jewish moral reasoning and so forth in to build more unity. And that was sort of set against the atheistic stance of Russia and the communists and the fascists and these kinds of things that sort of in the 50s kind of held this hegemony in place. And then in the 60s, all of this collapsed. One of the things that's part of the story is, and for all their talk of unity, if you were a non-Anglo-Saxon white Protestant, you didn't fit. You're sort of marginalized. If you weren't a man, if you were a person of color, if you weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you kind of got pushed to the side. And you did see places like Notre Dame that flourished, and other Catholic universities that flourished, sort of, but always on the margins. They weren't really brought into the mainstream pace-setting universities at this stage. And so the question in the 60s is, well, why not? Why are we being excluded? There really wasn't any good answer, because the Protestantism that existed, that hegemony that existed, was really just about sort of be nice to your neighbor kind of thing. There was really no doctrine. There was no doctrinal meat or standard there. And so what that meant now is you had this very multicultural environment, and religion had to kind of be pushed aside because there really was no common religion anymore. And you couldn't sort of push people into that box. And so what that meant was that your divinity schools became more studies about religion rather than training ministers. The campus ministries, instead of being sort of part of compulsory chapel attendance. Now what you had were groups like Crew and Navigators and different campus ministries that they're at the margins, but they're sort of all on a level playing field. Nobody kind of gets to have dominance. But in a country that's 85% or so professing Christian, there's always this fear from other groups that don't belong to that dominant group that they're going to take over. So there was this really strong push to kind of push things down, particularly Christian groups down. Why don't we have, you have a Center for Islamic Studies or a Center for Latino Studies or a Center for Women's Studies and so forth. Why don't we have a Center for Evangelical Studies or a Center for Protestant Studies on campuses? And the answer is because it's sort of, the same reason we don't have a Center for White Studies. It's what everybody is. And it's the dominant group that's been the oppressor. So let's push them aside to make room for everybody else. So this is sort of what's happening in the 60s. And sort of, or it starts kind of in the 60s and we see it bearing fruit today where it kind of takes us to where we are today, where all of that kind of gets pushed aside and the sort of the non-sectarian thing that can push our economy forward, that can build our empire and so forth with science. And that became the thing that became the centerpiece of the university. Donors funded it. Nobody's funding Centers for the Study of Philosophy or the Centers for the Study of American Religion. It's the ICAR and it's hospitals and it's these kinds of things that sort of drive industry forward. The donuts, which you get into. So it kind of takes us to where we are today. This collapse. And so then the question becomes, what are the arguments for and against silence? So there's sort of two schools of thought, and the one is that we should there has been this hegemony. Protestants have been sort of the oppressors. We need to step aside, kind of take a step back, and let other groups kind of have their time in the sun, as it were. But there's others that have the same stance that we shouldn't have sort of a distinctive Christian perspective in the academy or in society as a whole that come at it from a slightly different angle. So you have folks like Machen, who was a Presbyterian minister who founded the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the early 20th century. And you have this idea of the spirituality of the church, and the idea here is that you have sort of two kingdoms. You have the kingdom of the world and the kingdom of the church, and those two things don't blend. And so there's this sort of separation that you kind of expect to have happen. And there are sort of rules of the game that if you want to participate, we all have to kind of participate on equal footing. And so sort of a trivial example of that is that if you're sort of trying to figure out why the experiment didn't work this time, you don't say a miracle happened, or it must have been God's will that it worked this time. There was a miracle. So you can't reproduce it because a miracle didn't happen this time. You just, the rules don't allow that. And so the idea is that you really can't bring your faith into your scholarship. Like otherwise, you have no way of talking to people who don't share those common assumptions. The sort of other school of thought is, well, you do, we look at, we have these Bible verses on things like, let your light shine before men, go out and make disciples, always be ready to provide a reasoned defense. And so the idea is that we should be bringing our faith into the academy and trying to influence the academy, both through our scholarship and through our status as citizens within the university. And so you kind of have these, the tension in these two approaches. And so the question is, how do you navigate this? And so, and this is, I think, what George really wanted to address in this book is, what difference does it make? What does it mean to do Christian packaging science or to be a Christian packaging science professor? What does that even look like? Does a Christian study how you package food products differently than a Hindu professor would study how you package stuff? Or does a Sikh solve differential equations in a different way than a Buddhist solves differential equations? What does that even look like to talk about a Christian solution to differential equations? And so what Marsden would say here is that's not what I mean. That's not what I'm talking about. So of course, in different disciplines, depending on where you're at and what you're studying, the nature of what you're studying, your faith is going to impact that differently. And the closer you are to the human condition, the more connection there's going to be between your faith and what you're doing. So obviously, if your field of study is philosophy of religion, and you're an analytical philosopher sort of looking at arguments for and against the existence of God, obviously your faith and your faith commitments are going to make a huge difference in what you do. If your field of study is accounting and you're an accounting professor, maybe there the way you do your accounting and whatever it is that accountants do. It's all black magic to me. But so maybe it's not Christian. But the
It's miraculous.
yeah, it's a miracle. the it sort of it doesn't mean quite the same thing. And so one way we can look at it is sort of the narrow focus and sort of a broad focus. And so in the narrow focus is as a physicist, what does my Christian faith mean to me? And so one answer is it's in our scholarly agendas. What are the kinds of questions that we ask and that we're interested in asking? And how do we go and approach certain questions? So why, we see something kind of funny in the data or something funny in society and say, that's interesting. And the reason we say that's interesting is because we're informed by our faith to be attuned to those anomalies in the data, so to speak. And so Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist who's talked a lot about sort of the origin of morality and where does that come from and so forth, has pointed out that in social psychology, his interest is more sort of in political representation among social psychologists. At one of the meetings, he asked, how many people voted for Bush in the last election? It was like 1 out of 1,000 people in the audience who raised his hands, and his response is that this is not this is statistically absolutely improbable. There has to be a selection effect here, and the problem is that when everybody sort of has the same viewpoint or same ideology, certain questions just don't get asked. Fish don't know their way, and so you need these other perspectives. And this is sort of ties into challenging Assumption Stout, a historian at Yale who's looked at the history of the Puritans and so forth. One of the things that he did is he looked at the Puritans not from the perspective of the role they had in founding a nation, but sort of in sort of our religious context today. How did the Puritans influence religion today? And so it wasn't just the political stuff that mattered there. There was also religious things that mattered, and that influenced his scholarship in studying the Puritans. But I think another area that I think sometimes gets missed is that when we want to disseminate our results, we do stuff in the academy, and we want the broader culture to care, right? We don't just study accounting so that other accounting professors can be impressed with the way that we studied accounting. The idea is that we study accounting because we want to influence how society does accounting. But some of that, we spend a lot of time studying. Other people can't reproduce everything that we do. At some level, they have to trust us. They have to say, you know what, I trust that you guys know what you're doing. So you sort of trust your doctor. You don't go back and reproduce all the experiments before you have the surgery on your knee done. And so, well, how do they trust you? How do they know they can trust you? They need to know that there's people like them who share their values and their worldview generating the scholarship, or that are at least not opposed to it. And so for us to be effective at disseminating the scholarship that we do, whether it's nursing or automotive engineering or hot-button political things like climate change or the safety of vaccines or whatever, it's important that you have people doing that work that reflect the broader society, that reflect the values of the broader society and so forth. And so when you exclude a vast swath of society, or say you have to sort of hide the fact that you're a believer in order to participate in this, then believers in society aren't going to trust the fruit that comes out of that scholarship, or are less likely to. So exactly how you integrate your faith in what you do, what that means for a mathematician versus a philosopher is going to be the details are going to be very different. But it seems to me that in terms of setting scholarly agendas and challenging assumptions on what matters and what doesn't matter, and this whole idea of how do we get society to trust what we're doing, our faith becomes very, very important part of our identity as scholars. But then there's also, I think, broader issues. As people of faith, our curriculum. It's there was a lot of criticism of gen ed curricula going back to the '60s that they were all books written by dead white guys, and so. What about these other authors that are coming from other cultures? People who are sensitive to that. The white guys don't notice, because you don't see them as white guys. If you're a white guy, you don't see them as white guys. You just see them as books by authors. But if you're a person of color and you realize that there are no other people of color that are being included on our reading lists, that gives you sort of you have that outsider perspective. You bring something and you sort of shine a light on something that other people miss. I think that as believers that are heavily underrepresented in the academy, we have a perspective that some of our colleagues may miss. They don't even realize ways that they're being offensive or the ways that they're marginalizing our students, because it just doesn't. It's not that they're being nefarious or something necessarily. They don't see it. It's not part of who they are. A second is sort of our mission. talked about our mission statement. We're trying to decide where should Clemson go. We have a lot of different perspectives. As people of faith, we have something in common with a lot of South Carolinians that a vast swath of our faculty don't. And so we bring a perspective, not that that should be the only perspective or the perspective that should override everybody else's, but it's something that should contribute to our perspective on how this looks. An example of that, I think, is tied to access. I was looking up the numbers. When you hear these studies done showing the underrepresentation of Republicans or conservatives in the academy, one of the things to say, well, what do you expect? They're all a bunch of young Earth creationists, and they can't do. If you're going to be an obscurantist like that, you can't do scholarship. So of course they're going to be underrepresented. And if you go and you look at the polls, the latest Pew poll, it's something like, comparing Republican voters to Democratic voters, it's something like 60-40 numbers on Earth creationists. But what's interesting is that when you look at the numbers broken down by gender, you see the same thing. For women and men, it's something like 60-40. And when you look at it for African Americans and white Americans, you see the same kind of number. In fact, there it's a little bit more skewed. It's almost 70-40 there. And so you have this, you do have this sort of religious difference between underrepresented groups in the academy that does have a disparate impact on how welcome people feel. Now, am I saying that religion is the only reason that African Americans are underrepresented in the academy, or it's the only reason women are underrepresented in the academy? I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is it's one thing that hasn't been addressed that could be important, that we may be sensitive to and attuned to in ways that maybe others aren't. Sort of bring to bear on some of these when we talk about things like diversity and trying to increase access to the university, these sorts of things. And then finally, things like dissemination and outreach. How do we get our results out? I kind of touched on this a bit before, but more broadly, not just in our own narrow scholarly agendas, but when we talk sort of about how do we reflect Clemson as a whole to society? What does Clemson look like? What do people associate with Clemson? I think as people of faith, we have something to say. We have a perspective. We're sensitive and attuned to issues that maybe others aren't so attuned to. And so which brings me finally to just sort of my last maybe. So that's just another example. When we talk about sort of university governance, how should a university be governed? People have different perspectives on what the rights and responsibilities of faculty should be in sort of directing how the university goes. Again, we may have, from our experiences, say in churches or in different groups that we may belong to, we may have a different experience than other faculty that we can bring to bear on some of these questions. And so again, it's not so much a better perspective or the right perspective. We got to go show all these crazy secular liberal faculty the right way to do things. It's more a question of we have some other insight that they don't have that we can bring to the table. And so as citizens of the university, we have a responsibility to contribute to the life and direction of the university. We have something else to offer. That may not translate into quoting a Bible verse in the faculty senate meeting, but it may mean that when you're sitting on a committee meeting that by volunteering for these things and contributing to these things, we have just a different way or another way of looking at something else to add. Oh, maybe that's the last. So the last slide I had was just, there's really nothing on there that you need to look at, was this issue of sort of potential and pitfall. So what sort of opportunities do we have as Clemson faculty? And what are some of the dangers? And I think when we think about the reason I mentioned the history was we do have this history of hegemony, of dominance of the university. It's not that far in the past. We're talking sort of, there's people here who were college students in the 1950s, colleagues of ours that were college students in the 1950s who probably remember being forced to go to chapel to hear some sort of bland talk about being nice to people or whatever. And so, and this sort of oppressive idea of having to conform to this generic Protestant whatever, or this sort of assumption that that's part of who you are. And some of our colleagues here that aren't from the South, living in a place where there's a Baptist church on every street corner, may feel some of this may feel a certain oppression and so forth. And so when we talk about bringing our Christianity into the workplace, into our scholarship, into the classroom, you can imagine how this could be very threatening to a lot of our colleagues, or come across as threatening. And so when we talk about some of the potential pitfalls. The language we use, this idea of Protestant dominance is very closely tied to imperialism in the late 19th century, and this idea of sort of taking over. And when we talk about bringing our Christian faith into the classroom, if we talk about it in terms of crusades or taking back or taking over or winning for, that kind of language is very threatening to a lot of our colleagues. If you're Jewish and you're hearing someone talk about taking the campus for Christ, it's going to be a very, your guard's going to go up very quickly when you use that kind of language. So I think we have to be very sensitive to the fact that while we may be a minority, by traditional religious believers or traditional theists may be a minority in the university overall, we're the dominant culture in the state of South Carolina and really in the country as a whole. So we have to be careful how we come across with some of those things. I think the second is we don't want to put Christian scholarship into a box of Christian scholarship is when you're preparing, Bible studies or something, or theology question, when you're pursuing theological questions or philosophical debates about the existence of God. It's much broader than that. It's the idea of how does who we are as Christians influence the academy as a whole. And I think a good parallel are these different, we have gender studies and African American studies and Latino studies and so forth. And there it's not so much a question, African American studies isn't what is an African American or how does one define an African American. It's more a question of what is the African American experience and how does that experience bear on these different interdisciplinary subjects. And I think we could do some of the same things, think about it maybe the same way in terms of Christian scholarship. How does being a Christian, or how have Christians experienced some of these events or cultural shifts in ways that may be different than the way others have experienced it? And maybe instead of talking broadly about Christian just generically, maybe being more specific. What does it mean to be a confessional Protestant when evangelicalism is sort of the buzzword for everyone who's not a mainline? What does it mean to be a traditionalist Catholic in a culture that may see Catholicism as something that's very nebulous and very broad? So, and what is the difference in experience, and what does that mean for various questions that come up, history and sociology and so forth? I think one of the opportunities we have is that I think we do. People don't think very much, or they don't really have to think very much about what Christianity means for various subjects. It's sort of assumed that it doesn't. It's just irrelevant. And so we do have a lot of fresh, novel space to work with. That's a really rich opportunity. So there's a lot of what we call low-hanging fruit. When you break into a new intellectual field and no one's really studied it before, it's like all the easy questions. They're all easy questions at the beginning. So when a new telescope goes up, the people using ALMA right now, the big submillimeter telescope, are seeing the sky in a new way. Papers come up like that. It's really easy. And 20 years from now, after all the easy questions are solved, now you're going to be doing all the hard things. Progress is going to be slower. And so in some ways, I think some of the stuff that like George Marsden's been doing with this history, and Mark Knoll, on the history side, they're sort of taking advantage of some of this low-hanging fruit. It's kind of easy to make progress there and have this niche because there's really nobody else doing it yet. I think that's true sort of across disciplines, even more so once you move away from some of the fields where the Notre Dame Mafia has been sort of filling that gap in philosophy and in history. So Mark Knoll is a historian, also at Notre Dame now. Mark Knoll, Noll. And these guys I'm mentioning are more coming from an evangelical or conservative Protestant perspective here. So George Marsden is another one. Darren Dochuk is another one. Don't ask me to spell Dochuk. Tommy Kidd is another one. Tommy Kidd was a Clemson grad. Go Tommy. So there you go. So those are the four names that come immediately to mind that have sort of their roots in Notre Dame. In philosophy, it's people like Nick Wolsterstorff, Alvin Plantinga, Austin, I can't remember his first name, or a couple others that come to mind. John Fee is another one.
You have told us, O Lord, that the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving. You have told us, O Lord, that the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and sincere. May we, Christian faculty, not only desire to be wise, but may we desire to be wise in the way that you, O Lord, are wise. As faculty, we often take pride in what we understand and know about our areas of expertise. Yet you, O Lord, once said, "Let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches, but let him who boasts boast about this, that he understands and knows you, that you are the Lord, who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for in these you delight." Therefore I ask, O God, for Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, that you would give us the spirit of wisdom and revelation, so we may know you better. Pray also that the eyes of our hearts may be enlightened, in order that we may know the hope to which you have called us, the riches of your glorious inheritance in the saints, and your incomparably great power for us who believe. I pray that as we seek the wisdom that comes from heaven in this series, we would grow in our knowledge and understanding of you, O Lord. I pray that since we have been raised with Christ, we would grow in our ability to set our hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at your right hand, O God. May we grow in our ability to set our minds above, and not on earthly things. May we grow in strength to not love the world or anything in the world, for you have said that if anyone loves the world, your love is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from you, but from the world. As we decide each day in how to spend our time, I ask that you would help us be very careful how we live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. So I pray that we would not be foolish, but would understand what your will is. I ask, O God, that you would fill us with the knowledge of your will through all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Pray this in order that we would live lives worthy of you and will please you in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of you, being strengthened with all power according to your glorious might, so we may have great endurance and patience, and can joyfully give thanks to you, the Father, who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in the kingdom of light. I ask that you would help us offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to you, which is our spiritual act of worship. Pray that we would not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but would be transformed by the renewing of our minds, so we will be able to test and approve what your will is, your good, pleasing, and perfect will. I pray that you would help us become spiritually mature, that by constant use we would train ourselves to distinguish good from evil. Pray that although we live in the world, we would not wage war as the world does. May the weapons we fight with not be weapons of the world, but on the contrary, may they have divine power to demolish strongholds. May we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of you. And may we learn to take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And as we all depart today, each for the purpose you have called us to, may we think about these things. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, may we think about such things. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.